everyone, Kristina Werner here. Welcome to another video for SimonsStamp.com. Today I'm breaking out an older stamp set from Simon called Seeing Stars. I absolutely love this stamp set. I love stars, and I also love these three colors of Distress Oxide inks. I'm going to be using them today. I have this example of a blended piece, but today I'm not going to do any blending. I'm actually going to be using water with Distress Oxide inks and also the original Distress inks. We'll get to that in a little bit, but at this point in my creative process, I wasn't planning to use the original Oxide inks. I was purely going to use only the Oxides. So what I'm doing here is I'm pressing my Oxide ink pads or smushing them down onto a slick surface. This is a Tonic Easy Clean mat. You could also use a Ranger Craft sheet or anything like that. Anything that has a smooth surface that will let the ink kind of bead up on the surface. So I've got those three colors. I've got Seedless Preserves, Broken China, and Scattered Straw. And then I'm spraying it with a Distress spray bottle or any spray bottle you can use. So I've got some watercolor paper here. This is Strathmore Cold Press 5x7 watercolor paper. And I'm pressing that down onto these inks and moving my fingers around, spreading it around, giving it a little wiggle, and then I'll lift it up. And you can see that I've got a bead of color, because this is so wet, that has turned gray. And that's because all three of those colors mixed together turn gray. So I'm going to try to prevent areas of gray while I work with these three colors. Now, I do have to mention that they only turn gray with the oxides. When you're using the original Distress inks, they don't really turn this same gray shade. So with the remaining water droplets on my Tonic Easy Clean mat, I've dried my watercolor piece and then started pouncing it back into those areas. This is going to add additional layers of color, give it lots of interest. And this is the basic technique that I'm going to be using for today's video. After each time, I'm going to dry my piece and then I'll pounce it right back into more color. So I'm going to use my heat tool to speed up the drying process. You can see all of those wet areas created harsh water droplet textures on my watercolor piece. So I'm going to work in layers like I mentioned. So I'm going to add some Seedless Preserves Oxide ink to my work surface, spray that with a spray bottle, and then I'm going to drag my piece through those water droplets. You can see that it adds a whole layer of color. And I also want you to notice how much more opaque this new color is, how much it adds to the actual area and doesn't really allow as much color to show through. The Oxide inks are, in general, much more opaque. And so as you're using the Distress Oxide inks, just realize that as you layer them, you're going to get more color from that top layer. You can see how almost creamy that color texture is. It's not as transparent as when you're using the regular Distress inks. And you're going to get a really good comparison here in a bit, because I am going to be breaking out my original Distress inks as well. So I'm once again drying this and then putting more color out. This time I'm putting out some Scattered Straw. And even though this ink is more opaque, because it is yellow and it's not quite as vibrant as the other colors, the yellow isn't going to show up as much. However, if I had used a Scattered Straw original Distress ink, this color wouldn't have shown up at all. So I'm really happy that I have some little areas of yellow popping through. So I'm going to clean up that work surface and then I'm going to cut out my circle for my card. At this point, I thought I didn't need to use any additional inks. I was going to go ahead and just start stamping. So I've placed my circle after I ran it through my die cutting machine. I've placed that circle inside a Misty Stamp Positioning tool, and then I'm going to be stamping a bunch of these stars from the Seeing Stars stamp set. So I started out with just 2 stars, and I prepped the area with an anti-static powder tool, and then stamped both of these stars in Versamark ink. And I'm going to actually stamp these twice. And I'm doing this because watercolor paper in general has a really rough surface. It's not even, it's not smooth, and so it's very difficult to get a really clean line. And because these star images are very dainty, I knew I needed to stamp these twice so that I would get a good impression. So I sprinkled on some white embossing powder. This is alabaster embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, and then hit that with a heat tool till it was smooth and melted. I repeated that process, filling in the entire area of the circle with more of those outline stars and then eventually the solid stars that are included in the stamp set. So I'm sprinkling on some white embossing powder for these last few little stars and hitting that with my heat tool. At this point, I decided that I didn't like how pale the colors were in the background. I really wanted those stamp stars to stand out some more. So now I'm going to come in with some regular distress inks. I'm using chipped sapphire right here, and I'm doing the same process. I smush that onto my work surface, spritzed it with some water, and then pounced my piece into those puddles of color. You can see how much that intensifies the color, and also how the chipped sapphire goes on top of the colors that were already there, and it's much more translucent or transparent as it's adding the color. It's not quite as opaque, especially when you start to dry things. I'm adding another color. I'm using Seedless Preserves. Same process, smushing it onto my work surface, spritzing it with water, and then pouncing my piece into those water droplet puddles. So I'm going to kind of spread this around. I'm going to add another color. I decided to bring in Broken China. I wanted more blue, but not quite as intense as that chipped sapphire, which turns a little purple. So I'm adding some Broken China. You can see how it brings back that vibrant blue. And then I'll hit that with my heat tool. Now, because these inks aren't opaque and they're very dye-based, you can go back and clean up any of that ink that's on top of the white areas. Because the surface area of the embossed images is slick because of that embossing powder, it repels any water and ink. I then spritzed some water into the palm of my hand and sprinkled that over the area, and then used a paper towel to sop that up. And water reactivates the inks underneath and leaves me with some water droplet textures. So I'm done with that watercolor piece. I'm going to set it aside and work on the rest of the card. My card base was scored at 5.5, and it is made out of some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. I forgot the color name there for a minute. So I'm using some vellum for my greeting, and I'm prepping that vellum area with an anti-static powder tool, and then stamping those greeting stamps from the stamp set. Using some Versamark ink, I'll just put that down, and it leaves a really fine impression of all of those text lines. So I'm going to use that same embossing powder that I used before, and I'll just dip my vellum piece in here. Super easy. And then I'll hit that with a heat tool until it's smooth and melted. It gives it a nice, bright, white embossed line of text. I then put foam adhesive behind my circle watercolor piece, and I placed it down onto the card. At this point, I didn't know exactly what I was doing with that greeting, so I went ahead and adhered this down just so it was on the card. I decided I wanted to adhere this vellum piece directly on top of that circle, so I'm tracing a little line with my pencil, and I'll use some scissors to cut that out. This is so the greeting can go right up against the edge of that circle die cut. So I also realized that this vellum wasn't quite thick enough for what I was thinking. It didn't show, it didn't block enough of that color behind it to make it so that the words were very easy to read. So I decided to double up on the vellum, and I decided to try doubling up on the vellum by gluing 2 pieces of vellum together using Connect glue from Gina K. So I put glue all along the back of that little banner piece that I've cut out, pressed it down onto the rest of the strip of vellum, and then trimmed it out. So now I have 2 layers of vellum stuck together. And then I tried another adhesive method to put the banner on the card itself. I use a Xyron sticker maker, and I ran that through and then peeled off the top layer. So this basically applies adhesive to the entire surface area of this banner. And the whole idea behind adhering the vellum is you want the adhesive covering the entire area, and that way you don't see the adhesive. So I'm pressing that down, and then I finished off the card by adding some sequins. These are 8mm and 5mm sequins from Darice. This is the crystal color. So that is the card for today. Lots of fun with layering of Distress Oxide inks and also the original Distress inks. Hope you guys enjoyed this fun little project, and try it out using these colors. Is so fun. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in another video very soon.